Download the AllStar app. Make your picks for UFC fights, challenge your friends, level up and win prizes. Link in description. Get it now. All right, so Merab, he just became the bantamweight UFC bantamweight world champion,
Mm-hmm.
and he was on the podcast with Jake Shields. If you know anything about Jake Shields, you know a guy that a veteran, a Strikeforce champion, and a guy that says what he believes and doesn't really have a filter. He's uncensored. He's the one who attacked Michael Jackson inside the UFC PI, right? Or Mike
Ooh.
Jackson, sorry, Mike Jackson, not Michael Jackson. He's dead. But Mike Jackson inside the UFC PI because he was talking shit to him online. You know what I mean? And then he's one of those guys. If you say like something online, he's gonna come and get you if he sees you.
Oh,
Well,
nice.
anyways, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Merab and his comments about Umar Nurmagomedov, Habib, Islam Makhachev, and other caucus fighters. Talking about how they should not be considered Russian, right?
Mm.
And Dagestan. Um, what was the other country that you were mentioning earlier?
Dagestan, Chechnya,
Chechnya.
and and I think Ossetia is like considered a region within Russia, but
Okay.
that's yeah, one of the Russian
All right.
places.
So he was talking about his country, right? Because he's from Georgia, and
Mm-hmm.
it's near that region, I believe, the Eastern Europe. And he says that 20% of Georgia is still occupied by Russia, right?
Mm.
And there's a long history of that. The USSR, stuff like that. We're not gonna get into the history, and also I don't know the whole history, so I don't want to talk
Right.
about nonsense. Actually, not nonsense. I don't want to spew nonsense, right? But
Right, right,
anyways,
right.
what do you think of this? Like in your experience of meeting people from Dagestan and in your long career in wrestling and traveling around as well, like is there a thing like this? Like is there a thing of like people saying like they're Russian but they're not actually Russian?
Mm. Yeah. So in especially in wrestling, right? If you go far enough internationally or are in some situation where you train with people from overseas, you'll almost at some point run into someone who either trained like under former Soviet Union related countries. So like that includes the Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of those as well. So it's because it's a very distinct style. You can definitely tell if someone's like from that. They have a very similar style all throughout. It's a very it's almost like cut and paste, right? Like you can go to one academy or one school in one region, and then if you go to a completely different region, if it's under the same program, then the the warm ups are very similar. The techniques, the styles, they did a really good job in some sense of keeping stylistically everything super uniform. I don't know how happy they are if I call it like Soviet style wrestling because that's from decades ago already. But there's a very specific like system or program that they cover, and so it's yeah there's definitely still some political tension, just because like there's kind of two main things that happen as a result of um, having all these different countries that came out from the Soviet Union. And so one of them is that um, there's just a lot of unhappy people about like where the origin actually comes from. There's political tension. People want to claim themselves as their own nation, their state, or their country, or whatever. Um, but but it's also confusing to people who don't really know what's going on. Like they don't know the context because everyone speaks not only the similar language, but there's usually a dialect or a home language that's separate from that too. So you can speak Russian and then you can speak your own dialect within Dagestan or something like that, and there's a distinct difference between the two.
Yeah, he mentions Islam and Habib and Umar.
Mm.
They come from Dagestan. Hamzat Chimaev comes from Chechnya, or
Right.
Chechen Republic of Ichkera. I guess I never
Mm.
even knew that. And then Mavzar Evloev, who you probably trained with at Tiger,
Yep.
possibly.
Yeah.
He's
Mhm.
from a place called Ingushetia.
Yeah, that place I've not heard of. I think there's, but yeah, usually you kind of. I think I was watching Russian nationals or something multiple times, and like instead of the country that shows up, where you usually see in the competition board, you'll see the region,
Mm.
but it's also not in English, so most of the time I'm not sure like where people are from, but it will say like representing, and then whatever province, area that you're from. So there's quite a few of them. It's really like there are a few ones that are known for wrestling for sure. But yeah, like it's quite an interesting place. There's a fair bit of diversity there.
Does Dagestan or Chechnya have their own Olympic team, or is it usually
They
part of Russia?
so that raises the other interesting spot. So they currently represent, well, so before the Ukraine war, they represented Russia before that. And then now there's all these political sanctions of Russian athletes not being allowed to compete in international events. So that's why you see AIN. And I think that stands for something like Association of Independent Nations or something. But like 95% of that team is Russian. But it's basically a not a way to claim political asylum, but it's a way to compete in sport while saying, okay, I don't represent Russia. And so for people who want to compete, that's pretty much the only way around it if they're from Russia. Or the other alternative, since there were so many former Soviet Union countries, they have so like they'll change their nationality from, let's say, like a Russian passport to Uzbekistan, or to like Azerbaijan or something along those lines, right? And so you'll see a lot of people with Russian-looking last names, like the ones that end in the letter V. But you'll see them representing countries that are not Russia. So, for example, the Olympic champ at 74 kilos, he was actually out at Bangtao for 1 or 2 days, and he represented Uzbekistan. But his coach was like probably the most well-known Chechen wrestler of all time, the most
Oh,
accomplished
okay.
for sure. So like, so there's a lot of overlap. As far as the training goes, they don't seem to segregate in that way. They just go train at the same spot, and then when it's time to compete, then they're like, all right, cool, we'll just go to our respective countries and finish out the 2 or 3 weeks of the camp or whatever in the home country.
Yeah, you mentioned like political, personal, or whatever reasons that they have, right? Especially like in in the history of these nations. If we talk about Asia, what I mean, like there's a harsh reality that from World War II,
Hmm.
and all of that has a trickled down to a lot of people in these countries, like in the Philippines, China, Korea, Japan. What I mean,
Right.
it's just there's like a certain hatred, you could say,
Hmm. Yeah.
for Japan, because Japan's the one responsible for a lot of atrocities from World War II.
Yeah.
And like if you go to these countries, they will never say they'll probably never go to Japan, and even though that Japan might offer them a spot on the Olympic team. That's what's weird about the Olympics, man. You could change
Mm.
nations. Like it doesn't make
Right.
any sense. Um,
Yeah, because I had some, not like massive misunderstandings and miscommunications, and just things I didn't agree with a certain organization. And I was like, huh, I wonder if I can represent Singapore,
mm,
like overseas or something like that. And then I looked into the process, and there was actually, a website and a web page that said, okay, well, you just have to undergo this process, pick up a passport or something like that. And I think the timeline was like 2 years, 3 years.
mm.
So if you can time it right, that's the Olympic cycle is 4 years. So if you want to figure something out, do it at the start of the Olympic year, and then by the time the next Olympics comes around, you'll probably be able to represent a country that's not your native country.
Well, the Olympics is a goddamn mess, right? Like
It
it's
is.
a bunch of bullshit, goddamn mess, and I don't watch it. I don't really support it, but I'll talk shit about it all day. And and so like Merab, right? he's telling these guys, well-known guys, right, and everybody else that falls under these categories, that you're not Russian. You could say you're
Mm.
Russian, but you're not Russian. You're Dagestani. He doesn't have the right to say that. You know what I mean? Like, I
Yeah,
know
it's true.
there's it's obvious that he has a hatred towards Russia because what they have done in his country, and I
Hmm.
understand that. It's like it goes back to what I said about Japan and World War II, and like that still lingering in many of these nations and in the viewpoints of people, right? So
Right.
I think maybe it's just that underlying hatred for
Mm.
for Russia, right? That he just
I
says
think
these
so.
things. You
Yeah,
know,
it comes from a place of contempt for all things probably related to Russian government.
exactly, exactly.
And then there's I because I got the impression that it's not like a form of racism or anything on the along the lines of like, oh, I hate all Russian
Mhm.
people. He seems to have a lot of respect for like Russian like
Yeah,
countrymen and stuff like that, but it's just anyone that's related to anything government or political that he's like, no. Which, like, to be in all fairness, with how much political issue Georgia has had with Russia, that kind of makes sense. There's a lot of tension there.
yeah. And I'm very interested to see what they have to say about it. Because sometimes you see guys that they want to be connected to Russia, and then some guys they don't want
Mm,
to be connected to Russia, right? Some guys think like we have our own country. We're representing our own country, and then other guys are like, yeah, it's just all part of one Caucasus region. Like there's so many
right,
like
right.
that's why that's the problems with borders and like governments and all that, because that's what is created, that creates all of this.
Hmm.
Imagine there was no borders
Right.
and it was just towns and cities.
Hmm.
I wonder what the
That'd
world
be
would
pretty.
be like if it was
Yeah,
like
that'd be
that.
pretty
There
interesting.
is no passports
Yeah,
because you're a
it's like
world citizen.
yeah, world citizen. Yeah, like you because the it was in some like parody show that I watched, right? But I think it was either if you think about any fantasy movie or series or even like video game or whatever, there is no mention of immigration
No.
whatsoever, right? So it's like you're not watching Lord of the Rings being like, gee, I hope Frodo got his visa to Mordor,
Yeah.
right? Like that shit doesn't make any
No.
sense. So it's like a little bit of a comical thing. Like just from understanding like what's it called international relations, I can see why it ended up being put in place that way, but there's a lot about it that's just like that just feels backwards too.
Yeah, it is weird. Like the word immigration or immigrate, yeah, it is used, but it's not used in the same context as it is now, where you're like you have to get all this paperwork and you got to
Mm,
go through all this screening to even be allowed into a country, right? Or you have to have this book with your picture in it saying that you belong to this country and all these numbers
right.
and digits and letters saying that you are this person, and then you show it to them and then they approve it and they stamp it and you actually get to come into the country. Like I wonder if all of that stuff was removed, what would the
Mm.
world be like?